Hi everyone. Forgive me, my Arabic is not very good, so I'm gonna do this in English. Sorry. So I think I decided to talk about hearing God's voice because that's something that I'm struggling with at the moment. So I wanted to do some research and listen to some sermons and see what I thought would help us hear God's voice. So we all long to be close to God and to hear his voice clearly and to know his will in our lives. And we want him to answer all of our prayers, and we want him to answer quickly and all of our requests. Sometimes when we request something from God, he answers, and sometimes he answers quickly, and sometimes he doesn't answer and we feel like he's not listening to us. So how can I make sure when I request something from God that I move his heart and that he answers me? So one of the most important things in moving God's heart is to be brokenhearted. So brokenheartedness. So it reminds me of the story in the gospel where the widow, she was a widow and then her son died, and then Jesus raised him from the dead. So I'll just read that verse from the Bible. So in Luke 7, we read, "Now it happened the day after that he went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him, and a large crowd. And when he came near the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother. And she was a widow, and a large crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, 'Do not weep.' Then he came and touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still. And he said, 'Young man, I say to you, arise.' So he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother." So in that time, a widow, someone who'd lost her husband and now her son, it would have been very hard for her to live. She would have had no support. It would have been a very big struggle for her. She would have been not only tormented with sadness at the loss of her family, but also worried for herself and how she would live. And we also noticed the funeral was very simple. He wasn't wrapped in any linen cloth or any spices like they would usually do at the time. So this is most likely due to the poverty of that family. Her brokenheartedness moved the heart of God. He moves for compassion for her, and he raises her son from the dead. As we read in Psalm 51 every day, "A broken spirit and a contrite heart, these, O God, you will not despise." So when I'm broken, the Lord cannot despise. He's a gentle father. And another example in the Bible is Hannah, the mother of Samuel. So she was brokenhearted and despised by everyone because she couldn't have a baby. So most likely at the time, if you can't have a baby, people look at you as someone that sinned or did something wrong, and God's not blessing her with a baby. So we read in Samuel. So at this time she goes to pray in the temple, and she's so broken that her lips are moving but there's no words coming out. And there was a priest nearby, and instead of him comforting her, he calls her drunk as she's praying. And he makes fun of her, even though she's so broken already. So in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 10, "And she was in bitterness of soul and prayed to the Lord and wept in anguish. Then she made a vow and said, 'O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of my life, and no razor shall come upon his head.' And it happened as she continued praying before the Lord that Eli watched her mouth. Now Hannah spoke in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, 'How long will you be drunk? Put your wine away from you.' She's suffering, and she's going to the temple where she's most likely to be comforted, and then she's crushed even more. So Christ saw how broken she was, and he answered her prayer and gave her a baby. We can't approach God with arrogance and pride and expectation. This is what he despises, just like the Pharisees. He likes humble, broken-hearted. If we approach him like Hannah or like the widow, he will be moved with compassion. He is a gentle father. So what if you're not broken-hearted? There's enough going wrong in our lives that can make us broken-hearted, whether it's not having a peaceful home, or our children are far from God, or sickness, or financial problems and stress. These things can be a gift from God because it brings us to our knees, and God will look at us the same way that he looked at Hannah and he looked at the widow, and have compassion. If you're not broken-hearted, then our beautiful and wise church gives us ways to become broken-hearted. So it gives us the gift of fasting, so being hungry and tired. It gives us metanyas and the gift of service. So if there's a situation in my life that's difficult, the key to moving God's heart is compassion from God, is brokenheartedness. So from the same story about the widow, verse 12 says, "And a large crowd from the city was with her." So Christ says, "When 2 or more are gathered in my name, I will be in your midst." And Jesus also says, "If 2 of you pray for something, it will be done for you." So God's heart is moved when he sees people praying together in unity for one purpose. Jesus saw the crowd around the widow. They were all praying with her and suffering with her, and Jesus was moved with compassion. So it just reminds us, how often does our family get together and pray and fast and offer our hearts to the Lord as one home all together, like make a decision to pray together and spend time with Christ. And just like we see in Nineveh with Jonah, they all fasted and they all put on sackcloth, even the king as well, and God heard their prayer and fasting, and he did not destroy them. So let's follow the stories in the Bible and do the same and be brokenhearted and pray as in unity. God must be so moved when he sees a family praying together and suffering together. So instead of rushing to solve our problems ourselves, let's slow down and pray about it first. When we have compassion for others and we're praying for someone else, imagine how much more compassion Christ has for us. And also when it comes to our service, any issues in the service, if we get together with our servants and pray together, God has to solve those issues when he sees us all praying together. And praying in unity will result in God visiting you, whether that's at home or in your service or at work or wherever it is. And wouldn't it be wonderful for you to feel that God has visited you and to feel his presence so clearly and for him to answer your prayer so clearly? And just one more story. So there are 3 stories of Jesus raising people from the dead in the Gospels. The daughter of Jairus, the widow's son, and Lazarus. St. Augustine talks about these 3 stories. So Jairus' daughter, she had just died and she was in her bed in the story. The widow's son, he was in the coffin, so we can assume he was dead for about a day. And then Lazarus had been dead for 4 days and he was in the tomb, and there was a smell. So St. Augustine looks at all of these examples, and he thinks that this shows that we can hear God's voice no matter how deep we are in our sin. So at any stage of our sin, he can raise us from any situation that we're in, no matter how hard it is. Whether we've just sinned for a minute ago, or whether we've been living our whole lives in sin until now, we still have hope. So if we come to God broken and humble, we will hear his voice and he will answer our prayers. Thank you.